Welcome to SMU and to the Center for Presidential History. My name is Jeffrey Engel, and I have the honor of directing that center and therefore have the honor of introducing our speaker this evening, Professor Amy Greenberg from Penn State. Now, we promised Amy not only a warm welcome this evening, but also a warm southern climate. Now, I would not call this, of course, a proper Dallas winter, but I would like to point out to everyone that in State College today, the high was 9 degrees. So we got that beat. So, welcome then to this, our first public lecture of 2014, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening with us rather than watching the State of the Union address. I suspect you'll all be able to watch it taped later, but I would like to note, for the record, lest you think that we are trying to upstage the president, that we had the date first. Indeed, it occurs to me that perhaps President Obama is trying to upstage us. And thank you, Alan, for laughing at that. So, and it made me wonder, actually, if he has a secret disdain for James Polk, because Obama has yet to have a song written for him by They Might Be Giants. And if you did not get the reference, I will talk to you later about that. So, as always, for this series, we partner with the Bush Presidential Library for this lecture in presidential history and memoirs. To my good friend and partner, then, Alan Lowe, and to all of his staff and colleagues at the Bush Library, thank you and welcome. Now, our friends at the SMU in Taos office would like me to mention that if you've ever wondered what it's like to spend an entire weekend studying presidential history, Alan and I are again teaming up to teach a course at the Cultural Institute this summer, focusing on the topic of presidents and the wars of the West. There are a few brochures for the entire SMU Cultural Institute out in the lobby. Seats are going fast, so sign up now. And that shameless plug aside, let me take a moment to welcome some other friends of our center, in particular SMU's Board of Trustee member Bobby Lyle, and accompanied this evening by our center's #1 supporter, Lottie Brodsky. Welcome as well to our friends from the Bush Center and Institute, and to John and Lou Bowman, who lend so much support to the SMU Clements Center for Southwest Studies. And as always, our thanks to Provost Paul Ludden for his support in making all this possible. We have much in store for you throughout 2014. Indeed, I'd like you to ask you to mark your calendars, if you would, for an event this Saturday morning, co-sponsor with the Dallas World Affairs Council, when Ambassador Chase Unterberger will be describing his latest book, When Things Went Right, The Dawn of the Reagan-Bush Administration. Ambassador Unterberger, who is not only a journalist and a longtime public servant, but also a native Texan, served at the highest levels of both those administrations, and he has promised us an inside view of his vantage point of history. And mark your calendars as well, if you would, if you haven't already, for what I think is really going to be one of the biggest events of the year next month, right after President's Day, February 18th and 19th, when we will be partnering with the Bush Library once more, also with the Sixth Floor Museum, and SMU's Tower Center for Political Studies, as well as the McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility, to bring you 2 days of discussion on the topic of presidents and their personal crises. Put simply, the question that we're going to address is what happens when a president falls victim to those things that affect us all. Things such as a death in the family, things such as illness, or things such as, shall we say, lapses in judgment. Now, the real question is not so much what happened to them during those time periods, but when these events occur to them when they're in office, what happens to the nation? What happens to their administration when they are focused on these things that affect all of us as humans? 12 scholars from across the country will come to SMU to discuss 12 different presidents, including SMU's own Professor Tom Knock, who will be discussing Woodrow Wilson and his medical crisis. And we will have not one, but 2 keynote speakers for this event. First, Richard Reeves, the noted biographer of John Kennedy, and then Ambassador Karen Hughes, who, of course, served with distinction in the George W. Bush administration, but I think of far greater consequence, as you all know, she is a distinguished graduate of Dedman College and SMU. Now, as always, more information on these events can be found on our website, and in fact, I would encourage you to check out our brand new and revamped website. So without further ado, let me turn then to the reason for your all coming here tonight, which is to hear from Professor Amy Greenberg from Penn State, where she is the Edwin Erle Sparks Professor of History and Women's Studies. And we are indeed fortunate to have her here this evening. She is a noted teacher and scholar with a long list of awards for her research as well as her work in the classroom, and hers is a distinguished career indeed. She's a graduate of the University of California and also holds a PhD from Harvard University, where she was also a classmate and colleague of our own Professor Alexis McCrossan, who played no small role in bringing Amy here, so thank you for that. Professor Greenberg is one of the nation's leading historians of antebellum America, and she is the author of 4 books, including Manifest Manhood and the Antebellum American Empire, Cause for Alarm, the Volunteer Fire Department in the 19th Century City, great title, by the way, and most recently, A Wicked War, Polk, Clay, Lincoln, and the 1846 U.S. invasion of Mexico. These, I note, are, of course, available for you in a book signing after the talk. Now, it's the broad subject of that last book, the Mexican-American War, and more specifically, the President and First Lady who guided the country during that war, that is her subject for this evening. She is here to talk about the Polks, about Texas, about Mexico, and about the trials of the 1840s. And these, of course, are subjects of no small concern in these parts. And, of course, they continue our theme for this year, not only of focusing on the men who occupied the White House, but the women who were there as well. I know we're in for a fascinating discussion, and so please join me, if you will, in welcoming Professor Greenberg to SMU.
Thanks so much. That was a wonderful introduction. I want to thank everybody for turning out today, and particularly Jeff and Ronna Spitz and Brian Franklin for making my trip here so easy. I also want to put in a little plug for that They Might Be Giants song that Jeff gestured to. If any of you have children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews between the ages of 5 and 10, get that song, start playing it. It's very catchy, and I guarantee you, you will end up with an 11-year-old who knows for a fact the 3 great accomplishments of the Polk administration and why precious few mourn the passing of James K. Polk. So it's actually a great song. Good. Personally, having children, you know, it's like really impresses the teacher that they know about that. So it's very easy. It's an easy trick. Jeff invited me here to talk about my recent publication that he mentioned, A Wicked War, which offers a new analysis of one of the lesser-known conflicts in American history, the U.S. Mexican War. And I took the title from a quote from Ulysses S. Grant, who was a young lieutenant at the time of the war. And you can see the quote here. He said, "He didn't think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico, and he thought so as a youngster, but he had not the moral courage to resign." And I thought that was such a wonderful quote. The U.S. Mexico War, it hasn't been totally ignored by scholars. There's some wonderful books that are out there that are mostly military histories. John Eisenhower wrote a book called So Far From God, which covers the military history very well. There's a recent book by a guy named David Clary, which is another military history, which is really nice because it gives equal time to the Mexican and the U.S. side of the story. And since the 1988 publication of James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, the U.S.-Mexico War has sort of functioned in American historiography as the little war that led to the much greater war. So in other words, he takes the U.S.-Mexico War and all of the land that the United States takes from it, half of all of Mexico, and he uses that as the starting point to say, how did the Civil War become inevitable? Like, why did we end up there? As a teacher, though, I found all of these works unsatisfying for some reason or another. I wanted a book that wasn't necessarily focused on military stuff, that was focused on the cost of the war to individuals, to people and their families, to mothers who lost sons and wives who lost husbands on both sides of the border, and gave equal time to the anti-war movement that emerged out of the war, which I call basically the first anti-war movement in American history. But I could talk all day about that book, and I want you guys to buy it, so I'm not going to tell you anymore. And instead, what I want to do is talk about one of the characters that I got to know really well in the course of my research and became really fascinated with, and that is Sara Childress Polk, wife of President James K. Polk. And as I conducted my research on this book, I became convinced that this was a woman who actually wielded an enormous amount of power that people haven't recognized, and I became convinced that there was a need for a biography of her. And at this point, I want to give thanks just to two more people, a final nod. First to Aaron Crawford, who's a fellow here at the Center for Presidential History. He was a really key supporter of this project, and he's worked in the Polk papers, and also he gave me access to a tremendous amount of material. And then also my good friend, Professor McCrossan, who, upon meeting Aaron, immediately said, "You have to meet this guy. He actually knows about Sara Polk. You don't know, nobody knows about her." So thanks to both of you. And let me now tell you guys a little bit about Sara Polk, how she became the 19th century's most powerful first lady, what role she played in Polk's foreign policy, and finally I want to make some suggestions about why she was able to accrue and exercise political power in a period when women were supposed to be submissive, and not only were women not entitled to vote, but women actually weren't supposed to be involved in politics at all. Now, Sarah Childress, you see this portrait of her around the time of her marriage. She was born in 1803 in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And were it not for her marriage to James K. Polk when she was 20 and he was 28, no one would know her name. She would have faded into obscurity like all the 19th century women whose identities, like their names and their property, were subsumed into their husbands upon marriage, and who devoted their lives to their family and kind of disappeared as a result from the historical record. Now, according to rumor, it was Andrew Jackson, the original Old Hickory, who encouraged James K. Polk, who was then a young state legislator, to court the teenaged Sarah Childress. Now, Polk had gone to school with Sarah's brother and had met and admired the young woman. He followed Jackson's advice in this, as in pretty much everything in his career. And the couple married at her parents' plantation in Murfreesboro in 1824. Now, Polk and his bride hailed from remarkably similar circumstances. They were both slave-owning Presbyterians at the very pinnacle of Western society. So they owned a lot of slaves. Both families had speculated in land and made a lot of money off of that. And both families, interestingly, looked for educational opportunities for their progeny that were not available on the frontier in Tennessee. So both James K. Polk and Sarah Childress were sent to North Carolina to go to school because their parents recognized that these were really, really smart individuals. So quite unusual for the time. Sarah Childress went to the Moravian Female Academy, where she actually received an education in Greek and Latin and mathematics, which were subjects which normally men would only have had education in. And like her future husband, she excelled academically. Sarah and James were a natural pair, and the union of these two people pleased both families. So it was seen as kind of a natural and good thing for the families in their minds to bring a union of these two really powerful clans together. Now, after her marriage, Sarah and James and their slaves moved into a small cottage on the larger Polk property. So in other words, they did not set up housekeeping on their own. Now, a lot of brides would have problems with this setup. I don't know that a lot of people would want to move into their mother-in-law's houses, but this actually suited Sarah Childress, now Sara Polk, just fine. And the reason why is that because she was living in her mother-in-law's house, she was not responsible for entertaining. All cooking of food, everything was done by her mother-in-law. Now, in the normal course of events, she would have become pregnant and she would have started to have children and she would be occupied with that. But James had undergone experimental surgery for bladder stones when he was a teenager, and he was left unable to father a child as a result of this. So she's living in her mother-in-law's house, she's not responsible for any housekeeping, any entertaining, and she doesn't have any children to take care of. Now, in many ways, Sarah Childress Polk was a conventional Southern lady of her time and place. She venerated her husband among all other men. She took the biblical injunction to obey your husband quite seriously. She spent way too much money on clothing, particularly hats and shoes imported from Paris. And she believed in her heart, and I'll show you some evidence for this later, that black men and women were meant to live their lives in slavery, that was actually intended, and that was what was supposed to happen. Now, she was, as I mentioned before, a Presbyterian, and she was a strict Presbyterian of the old school, who continued to believe that hierarchy was predestined, white above black, men above women, while more evangelical sects had begun to question this received wisdom, asserting the equality of all men and women, regardless of color, in God's eyes. But these Presbyterians held on to the old creed. They didn't buy into that at all. As a slaveholding Calvinist Presbyterian, she knew that having power meant the difference between life and death, and that God intended the powerful to guide the weak with a firm hand. So as a slaveholder and as a woman, I think she was able to understand this dynamic in a particularly nuanced manner and to appreciate the value of power more than maybe some other people might. But in a number of other ways, Sarah was decidedly atypical, and above all else, it's the fact that she was childless and she remained childless. This is an era when childbearing and rearing defined a woman's life. There's another way in which Sarah Childress was really different from other women, though, and this actually asserted itself before her marriage even, and probably was a reason why she and James were attracted to each other, and that was that she was very involved in party politics, even as a young woman. She delighted in party politics, not just the legislation and the principles that impacted life for all Americans and inspired fierce partisanship among the two main parties of the period, the Democrats and the Whigs. But she also liked the practice of party politics, the campaigning, the gossip, the coalition building, and the elections that took up a vast majority of candidates' time in this time period. And she came by this naturally. Both her father and her brother, she was very close to both of them, were very politically active, so she kind of was raised in this milieu. Also, the first 2 decades of Sarah Childress's life coincided with a vast expansion of the franchise in America. So the Democratic Party became very active in basically giving the vote to all white men, even if you didn't own any property. So there's this kind of vast expansion of the franchise. People are very energized about politics, and this happens at the same time that she's kind of coming of age. So, you know, she's the perfect partner to James Polk, and as the years passed, they forged a union of remarkable strength. She fulfilled all the normal expectations for political wives. She was social, where he was not a social person, and she was very solicitous of his fragile health. She fought a valiant battle to get him to eat and sleep on a regular basis, but theirs was far from a typical 19th century marriage. Childless in an era when, like I said, the birth and upbringing of children defined a woman's married life, Sarah threw herself into her husband's work. Now, James K. Polk was what we today would call a workaholic and also probably a control freak. But he did something really remarkable. He managed to actually harness Sarah's abilities to advance his own agenda. So far from being threatened by her capabilities, he embraced them very, very early on. And she wrote an account of this later in her life, and she said, very early in their marriage, she would say to James when he was staying up late looking at newspapers, she'd say, you know, put out the lamp and come to bed. And he instead put her to work. Taking up a newspaper, he would reply quietly, this is her words here, Sarah, here's something I wish you to read. And then he set me to work too. Soon she was analyzing political debates for him. He would hand her a pile of papers and he'd say, tell me what's in these. She became a regular companion on his political excursions, one of the only wives who traveled with their husbands at the time. And again, this is because she doesn't have children. She's the only political wife without children, so she goes with him when he travels. He always wished me to go, she recalled, and he'd say, why should you stay home, to take care of the house? Why, if the house burns down, we can live without it. Now, whether James's primary goal was preventing his wife from becoming lonely in their childless house or whether he needed her advice, Sara Polk became James K. Polk's closest political advisor, and this suited her fine. Knowing much of political affairs, she found pleasure in the society of gentlemen, a friend of hers remarked. Rather than socializing with the wives, Sarah could be found with the men. Quote, she was always in the parlor with Mr. Polk. Now, Sarah Childress Polk was every bit the Democratic stalwart as her husband, and of the two, more ambitious. James liked to joke that had he remained the clerk of the legislature, she would never have consented to marry him, but that probably wasn't far off the mark. Before their wedding, she extracted a promise from him that he would run for Congress, and he did so, and he won. And it's very interesting, these early years of her marriage, her sister-in-laws write her a lot of letters, James had many sisters, full of information about babies and housekeeping, but at the same time, her own brother and some of James's friends are writing her strictly political letters that are full of the kind of material that they would write to other men. And seeing what she wrote back to them, it's very clear that she's more engaged with the political material than she is with the childbearing material, not surprisingly. It may not have been clear to her in the late 1820s that she belonged to the world of men more than that of women and had more to contribute to that world, but it soon would be. Here we see a picture of Washington, D.C. in the 1830s, and I think that in order to understand how Sarah accrued power, you need to understand something about Washington, D.C. in this time period. Now, Congress, of course, is in Washington, D.C., and congressmen almost never brought their wives with them. There were some senators whose wives lived with them. They would set up a proper housekeeping, but congressional term was considered too fleeting, and basically people had to stay home. So congressmen would lodge in boarding houses, and they didn't bring their wives. So James, following convention, when he first goes to Congress, he goes by himself, but they are miserable being apart from each other, and they write these letters to each other. And he quickly realizes that, in fact, Sarah would probably be happier with him in a boarding house than at home in his mother's house without anything to occupy his time. So after the first year in Congress, Sarah goes up and moves up there with him. And she thrives in this intensely political environment of the almost all-male boarding house. She turned her Washington boarding house into a political salon, taking extra rooms strictly for the purpose of political entertaining. So she doesn't just have the rooms that they stay in, there's actually extra rooms where she brings people in and they have sort of a political salon. Washington, D.C. in the 1830s was very, very different than it is now. It was basically a small town. Now, there were 18,000 people who lived in Washington, D.C. in 1830, but the political class was much, much smaller. And it was really, in effect, a small community that ran on gossip. Men exchanged rumors about personal and political indiscretions, about secret alliances, and about political fortunes. And women exchanged rumors about sexual indiscretions, courtship, and economic fortunes. Gossip became a fixture of national politics during the very first Congress, when the absence of established political parties, this is before the Whig and the Democratic Party come into being, when the absence of established political parties increased the importance of personal reputation on a man's political success. Now, by the 1820s, we do have established political parties, but Washington's men and women gossiped constantly, but separately. Women would gossip with women and men with men. Now, talk of this sort did more than just titillate and entertain. It could have a transformative effect on a man's political career or even the fate of an entire presidential cabinet, as I'll tell you in a minute. Now, Sarah was the first political wife to successfully bridge the gap between male and female gossip. She was equally comfortable in both worlds, and she learned that men were willing to tell her things that they might not tell another man, and that wives were the best source of information about husbands and the men they entertained. Now, historian Rachel Sheldon has recently published a wonderful book called Washington Brotherhood, which argues that due to a variety of local circumstances having to do with the absence of a lot of congressional members from Congress at any given time, the inability to hear anything in Congress, people eating at their desks, people smoking at their desks, people sleeping at their desks, very little of importance actually happened in Congress itself. The place that things actually happened was outside the halls of Congress. So it was in private parties, dinner parties, it was political clubs, it was in bars, it was in a variety of external environments outside Congress where the real important work of Congress actually took place, where alliances and decisions were inevitably made. And Sarah's facility in this realm, I think, was of crucial importance to buttressing her husband's position. She set the conditions for Polk to form alliances and influence other men. Now, Sarah's access to news and her skill in deploying it drew men to her. She was by no means a beautiful woman. She was very self-conscious about her bad teeth, which is why you always see her with her mouth like this. She had an overly prominent nose, but she also had very pretty hair and very bright eyes and a very youthful figure. And she really just radiated intelligence and charm. So it's very interesting to read physical accounts of her and what people would say about what she looked like, and then you look at a picture of what she really did look like. Like, for instance, people inevitably described her as being tall, but in point of fact, when you look at her ball gown, she was only 5'3", which was by no means tall for that time period. So I think, in part, it was that her husband was short, but she also just seemed bigger than she actually was. She radiated that kind of power. Uh-oh. Didn't mean to do that. Oops. Hold on here. Sorry about that. Even when she was surrounded by more conventionally beautiful women, she really stood out. She was very self-possessed. She was always beautifully dressed. And men often attributed her good looks to her childlessness. So they would say that in private and in public, oh, she's never had children, that's why she looks so beautiful. But I think it's really interesting. As an older woman, she was inevitably described as exceptionally handsome and remarkably well-preserved. And if we had more time, we could go into this. But by all accounts, she was a great conversationalist, and her husband was not. He was a terrible conversationalist. He hated making small talk, but she was fantastic at this. She had great manners. She had a real eagerness to please. And women were fond of her, but her closest relationships were all with men. First with her father, then after his early death with her brother, and then many of James's political colleagues in Tennessee, but above all else with James, her husband. Now, none of these men, including James himself, could be considered enlightened about gender relations. None of these people were progressive in their thoughts. But all of these men, when you read letters they wrote her, they're basically treating her like an equal. They're not talking down to her. They're giving her political information straight, and they expect her to respond in turn. Now, there isn't a great deal of correspondence between James and Sarah Polk because they were together most of the time. But what correspondence survives shows that Sarah felt comfortable advising her husband about both politics and tactics. She warned him against running for a short session in the Senate. She told him which editors were not to be trusted. And he never, as far as I can tell, with one exception, ignored her advice. Nor was James the only politician who turned to Sarah Childress Polk for advice. Congressmen, senators, and a justice of the Supreme Court sought her opinion on political matters and depended on her for the inside information that enabled the successful navigation of this fraught Washington political scene in the era of the second party system. One Supreme Court justice wrote to ask if the votes in a certain county were amiss, adding, "No one is likely to know as well as you." Now, Sarah remained in Washington with James for 13 years, accepting the 1830 to 1831 congressional term, when an explosive debate over Peggy Eaton, the wife of President Andrew Jackson, Secretary of War, tore the cabinet apart. Now, the Eaton Affair shows just how crucial gossip was at this time. Many Washington wives refused to speak to or receive Peggy Eaton, believing her to be of low morals. And I'd love to tell you about the story in great detail, but in short, Eaton was accused of seeing Peggy when she was married to another man, and then he subsequently killed himself, and then she married him. So Peggy had some issues. Now, Andrew Jackson, however, believed Peggy guilty of the aspersions cast upon her, and he threatened members of his own party with retribution if their wives did not treat Peggy Eaton with respect. Now, Sara Polk was caught in the middle of this debate, torn between her friendships with women like Florrie Calhoun, John C. Calhoun's wife, who completely shunned Mrs. Eaton, and her concern for her husband's career. And she sided with her husband, publicly acknowledging Peggy Eaton in the streets, and asserted to the other wives that it was crucial to put country before personal scruples. So she didn't try and make any argument about, like, oh, Peggy's okay. She just like, look, this is about country first. Now, this ended up being a really wise gamble. James emerged from the controversy unscathed when a lot of other politicians were just shunted to the wayside by Jackson. And with Jackson's support, he won the position of Speaker of the House of Representatives in 1835. Her husband's position provided Sarah with new authority among the wives of Washington's most powerful men. In 1839, however, James resigned the speakership, or he didn't run again, in order to return to Tennessee to run for governor. And at that point, a number of men wrote letters in support of Sarah, saying how much they would miss her. One man wrote that he wrote a poem praising Sarah's playful mind. And in the months after their exit from Washington, Sarah received several letters that indicate her power. One senator bemoaned her absence from a city where, quote, "a woman can learn more than a man, greatly more." And he missed getting information from her. Now, over a decade at this point of political service to her husband, meeting his often onerous demands for political news and analysis left Sarah Childress Polk singularly able to provide it. At this point, James became governor of Tennessee, and Sarah was much more of a success as a kind of graceful, dignified, but down-to-earth Tennessee First Lady than James was as governor, and he was defeated for re-election twice. Now, for 2 years, James did very little except travel around Tennessee trying to drum up votes. And what's fortunate about this for scholars is this is the biggest cache of letters that we have between the two while they were separated while he was campaigning. And what they show is that by this point, he had become completely dependent on Sarah for political information. "You must send me news," he repeatedly wrote her, asking her to lobby various editors and politicians. And it's clear that she felt like she was unable to live up to his demands and his expectations of what she was supposed to give him. She once replied with exasperation when he said, "You need to find out what's happening in this particular county." She replied, quote, "I'm unable to learn anything with a house full of guests. I trust you won't hold it against me that the housework is neglected." Now, his response doesn't survive from this, but I think the comment itself indicates how playful they were with the gender conventions of the time, that basically she realizes what he basically wants from her is political information, and he really doesn't care what happens with the guests. That's not going to stop him from getting what he needs. But at the same time, she's frustrated that she's thrust into this position, which is really the first time she's been in this position when she's in the State House, because remember, as a young woman, she was in her mother-in-law's house. She didn't have to entertain people. In the boarding house, she entertained people, but she really didn't have to do much. So finally, she's in charge of entertaining, and it isn't working for her. She became so depressed during his extended campaigning that she wrote a really very sad letter to him, and he responded in what seemed a rather harsh manner to me, just like, "Buck up." But he made sure that he was never separated from her for more than a week after that again. So they returned to being together, and that separation didn't happen again. Now, James's fortunes improved dramatically in 1844 when President John Tyler attempted to annex the Republic of Texas. The two frontrunners for the nomination in 1844 were Henry Clay, the Whig, and Martin Van Buren, and both of these candidates opposed Texas annexation, and you can see here a New York petition in opposition to the annexation of Texas. Now, both Clay and Van Buren issued strikingly similar letters to each other explaining why they opposed the annexation of Texas. They both said that it would lead to war with Mexico, and they both said that it would exacerbate political tension. So this is why they opposed it. They weren't going to have anything to do with it. Now, but James K. Polk was a different story. He firmly believed both in Texas annexation and in manifest destiny. And his family and Sarah's family had both grown wealthy, speculating in lands on the western frontier, lands that had been taken from eastern Indian tribes. So tribes were moved off of the land. The Polks and the Childresses moved in, they speculated in it, they started farming that land with the help of slaves, and this is how they became rich. So both of these families had grown rich basically off of manifest destiny, and I don't think it's really any surprise that Polk was an early and fervent supporter of both the annexation of Texas and manifest destiny as a whole. Polk issued a letter in favor of Texas annexation that you see here in April of 1844. And he found an eager national audience for his argument that Texas wasn't part of Mexico. Texas originally belonged to the United States. It came into the United States as a part of the Louisiana Purchase, and only the bungling, idiotic foreign policy of John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State under James Monroe, foolishly gave Texas away. So basically what he was saying is the United States isn't taking Texas from Mexico, it's reclaiming land that really was ours to begin with, and this is what this letter says here. And the following month after he issued this letter on the annexation of Texas, he became the first dark horse candidate in American political history, winning the nomination of the Democratic Party, contrary to everybody's beliefs. So basically, he becomes the candidate for the Democratic Party. Now, Sarah Childress Polk serves as James's campaign coordinator. When Polk was first nominated, and here you see a wonderful campaign ribbon for the Polk and Dallas team, and right up at the top it says, "Alone but not deserted Texas." So this is how crucial Texas is to this, this political race. Now, when Polk was first nominated for president, one friend of Polk's wrote him and said he needed to put Sarah to work. He said, "James, that you might lack the time or tact to conciliate and please, but Sarah could. The wife of a man aspiring to the White House is no minor circumstance," he pointed out. "Mrs. Polk should be visited by Whigs and by Democrats of her own sex, as the ladies of the other side uniformly speak well and generally highly of her." And even Polk's allies, recognized that young Hickory's prickly personality sort of required management. But fortunately, Sara Polk, unlike her husband, was described by many people as ever a good listener. Now, the candidate didn't need prompting. He already knew his wife's political value. She took her job seriously, and she proved to be completely dedicated to winning the presidency. Polk was elected in 1844 in large part because of his stance on Texas, but Sarah's reputation as this incredibly pious woman of great virtue also played a big role in the way that the candidates were presented to the public. Now, what I found very interesting when I looked into this material about the election was that some Whigs who were outright hostile to James actually were supportive of Sarah, and it made them think that maybe this isn't going to be so bad. Sarah Preston Hale, who was a firm Whig of a firm Whig family in Massachusetts, she wondered at the time of the election if, quote, perhaps Mr. and Mrs. Polk together will make a very good president. So that's the end of a letter like, he's no good. Now, the two headed to Washington, and they set up a shared office in the domestic quarters of the White House, and you see the White House here in 1840. James left her piles of newspapers each morning to digest. She diligently worked through them all, and then carefully folding the papers with the marked pieces outside, where at a glance he might detect them, she would place the pile of papers next to his chair, so that whenever a few moments of leisure came, James could find these papers, see what the important parts were, and read them without a loss of time. They regularly put in 12 to 14 hours of work a day. Polk admitted near the end of his life, quote, none but Sarah knew so intimately my private affairs. But even at the height of his powers, Polk was pretty open about the degree to which he and his wife had always worked as a team. And typical was his comment when Sarah broke up an impromptu concert given by Democrats in his honor on the Sabbath. She just said, no, this is not going to happen, and he called it off, and he said, Sarah directs all domestic affairs, and she thinks this is domestic, so it was just called off. Now, the hopes of Sarah's constituents upon the time of their election are documented in tons of letters that she got, which are really fascinating, and all of these letters, without exception, reveal normal expectations of women for the time. All of these people writing letters expect her to be a model of religious propriety and to guide her husband's behavior by setting a moral example. Now, in fact, James and Sarah's relationship bore very little resemblance to what the public imagined. Not only were they political partners, but it was generally James who set the moral example for Sarah as opposed to the other way. Sarah was very beneficent in public, but highly judgmental in private and not above sharing hateful gossip. And James was constantly saying to her, like, you can't say that. That's really not nice, Sarah. Please, Sarah, come on, let's not go there. She was 42 when her husband was elected president of the United States in 1844. I love this photograph, this very early photograph. And you can see James and Sarah standing in sort of the middle of the photograph with Thomas Hart Benton right behind James and Cave Johnson, who was the Postmaster General, and then various other people. But the person I want you to see here, standing right next to James, the woman is a little bit blurry wearing a white hat, is Dolly Madison. And Dolly Madison takes Sarah under her wing and really guides her through basically what it means to be a good sort of White House wife, and they become very good close friends. With the guidance of her mentor, Dolly Madison, who pioneered the art of drawing room politicking very early in the presidency, Sarah learned how to employ domestic skills, which were clearly never her strong suit, in the service of politics. But she also took liberties that Dolly Madison would never have dared. Dolly gossiped with other women. Sarah gossiped directly with men. That's something Dolly Madison would never have done. Now, Sarah, like I mentioned, she's a very religious Presbyterian, and her religious piety required that she shun what she called, quote, the follies and amusements of the world. So she banned hard liquor, dancing, and card playing from the White House. Yet she managed to pull off incredibly entertaining dinners, some of which were 4 hours long, in which gracious hospitality combined with sort of ceaseless lobbying. Dressed in simple but meticulously tailored gowns of deeply hued velvets and satins, she cultivated a restrained elegance which was in keeping with her democratic ethos. So one thing that Democrats wanted to do was act like common people, and she made sure that she was always dressed very, very simply, although quite expensively. She held 2 evening political receptions each week and added a third each Saturday morning when Congress was in session. When James was unable to attend these events, she hosted them alone. Powerful men cultivated her goodwill. They wrote in their diaries and to each other that, of course, you had to show up at these events, and of course, you had to talk to Sarah, or else you'd be in big trouble. And more than one leading politician openly declared he would rather discuss issues of the day with Sarah than with her, quote, dour husband. Now, she was a brilliant entertainer, but she had little interest in other domestic matters. Quote, she said the servants knew their duties, and she did not undertake the needless task of directing them. That was written by a rather exasperated guest at one of her dinner parties. Social events didn't always run as smoothly as they might, had the First Lady been in the kitchen directing the servants rather than in the parlor with the men. She once presided over a dinner where there were no napkins on the table, and she completely failed to notice. And on another occasion, when Senator Thomas Hart Benton came to dinner and the appointed hour for dinner had passed, he asked Sarah if he had come at the right time. Colonel Benton, she responded, have you not lived in Washington long enough to know that the cooks fix the hour for the dinner? This was her response. Another key move that Sarah made, which I found absolutely fascinating, was that she had 2 nieces living in the house with her, and she made them return all of the calls that other Washington wives made on her into the White House. And this freed her from the main time sink of Washington political wives, which was returning calls made by other important women. She refused to do any of them, and she would send out her nieces to do that, which completely exasperated them, she was the first person to do that. She was also the first woman to actually establish a set area where wives could congregate after dinners, sort of apart from the parlor where the men would go, but then she was never there. So she would set up a space for the wives and then not show up there. By the time James and Sara Polk embarked on the U.S. Mexican War in May of 1846, Sarah controlled physical access to her husband and served as his private secretary. And here's a picture of Polk at the height of his powers. Now, on April 25th, 1846, James K. Polk told his assembled cabinet that the time had come to, quote, take a bold and firm course towards Mexico, and forbearance is no longer either a virtue or patriotic. He wanted to invade Mexico. Problem was Mexico really hadn't done anything at this point. Now, employing a language more common to dueling and other affairs of honor among Southerners than to high diplomacy, Polk was adamant that the U.S., quote, take redress for the injuries done us into our own hands. According to him, by rejecting Minister John Slidell, by refusing to pay claims put forward by U.S. citizens, and above all, by refusing to recognize Texas's ownership of the Nueces Strip, Mexico had insulted the United States to such a degree that the honor of the U.S. required that the southern neighbor be punished. As for the many injuries the U.S. had done to Mexico, the annexation of Texas, the occupation of the Nueces Strip, repeated insults provided by America's incompetent and offensive ministers, none of them factored into Polk's analysis. Mexico, inferior in his opinion in both race and power, must necessarily bend to the will of its stronger neighbor. Now, to those who suggested that it might be unseemly or even unchristian to invade a weaker neighbor, and everyone in the U.S. sort of agreed Mexico was weaker. Polk argued, quote, we must treat all nations, whether great or small, strong or weak, alike, which of course wasn't true because he didn't start a war with Britain over the Oregon Territory, but I'm not going to go there right now. What I do want to point out about this exchange and his understanding of what's going on with Mexico and his response to it is that Polk's reaction to the Mexico-Texas situation was unquestionably shaped by his experience as a slave master. Now, some slaveholders like Henry Clay or Thomas Jefferson a generation before struggled with the knowledge that slavery was wrong. But like most intensely conservative slave owners from the South in the 1840s, Sarah and James Polk believed that the domination of white over black was part of God's plan. James may have been influenced by his wife's views on this point. He liked to repeat evidence of Sarah's acumen on this topic by relating a conversation the two had on a hot July afternoon in the White House. Gazing out the window at slaves working the grounds, Sarah interrupted her husband from his writing with the assertion that, quote, the writers of the Declaration of Independence were mistaken when they affirmed that all men were created equal. When James suggested, this is just one of your foolish follies, Sarah, she elaborated, there are those men toiling in the heat of the sun while you are writing and I am sitting here fanning myself, surrounded with every comfort. Those men did not choose such a lot to life, and neither did we ask for ours. We were created for these places. A domination of the strong over the weak, white over brown or black, was not just the reality of slavery, it was also right in this view. And I have found at least 5 different occasions where James would tell this story about what Sarah's views were in order to kind of make a point about his own views. Now, that James K. Polk viewed international relations through the lens of slaveholding and dominance is notable but not particularly surprising for a Southerner who modeled himself on General Andrew Jackson. Newspapers throughout the South echoed the belief that national honor, like personal honor, was a matter of highest significance and one which sometimes required the physical reprimand of inferiors. Just before Polk addressed his cabinet on why he thought we should invade Mexico, the New Orleans Bulletin explained that, quote, "The United States have borne more insult, abuse, insolence, and injury from Mexico than one nation has ever endured from another. We are left no alternative but to exhort by arms the respect and justice which Mexico refuses to any treatment less harsh." If other nations, if the U.S. didn't punish Mexico, other nations, the Bulletin said, would lose all respect for the United States. Now, Sara Polk, as fervent believer in manifest destiny as her husband, agreed that the nation's honor must be upheld at all costs. Quote, "Whatever sustains the honor and advances the interests of the country, whether regarded as democratic or not," she stated at a dinner party in defense of the war, she admired and applauded. This was her response. Now, we have no idea what role Sara Polk played in the day-to-day management of a war that brought all the land from Texas to the Pacific coast into the hands of the United States. But a perusal of James K. Polk's diary during the 16 months of the war reveal a man strangely out of touch with reality, hardly aware that the country was turning against his war. And I have an image here of the massacre of Mexican civilians at Agua Nueva, which was a massacre which was widely reprinted in newspapers and roundly condemned. And Polk makes no notice of this or any other massacre in his diary whatsoever. Now, I think Sarah played a crucial role in this. She controlled access to Polk, and she edited his news intake. So she was giving him the news that he needed, and that was all that he was getting. And I think she was able to limit his exposure to this increasingly vindictive attacks on his presidency. And at the same time, it's her social skills and mastery of gossip which were playing a crucial role in enabling him to sort of assuage the competing factions of his party during an increasingly unpopular war. Now, the press was fully aware of Sarah's political party. They could hardly miss it when she directed newspaper editors to legislation and letters that vindicated her husband at the expense of other politicians, or when she pulled an important senator aside in order to list the reasons why he should support a Polk policy against the interests of his constituents. The press reported these clearly political stories while asserting that the First Lady's assiduous efforts in the support of her husband were proof of her female submission. So she was doing all of this for her husband, which proved that actually she was a good wife. Sara Polk also was a master of public relations. She cultivated a public image of pious subservience and democratic equality that was at striking odds with reality, and the nation loved her. It helps she was the first real First Lady in the White House since the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828. The wives of Jackson, Van Buren, and Harrison all died before reaching the White House. John Tyler's first wife was an invalid, and his second wife spent only a few months there. So Sara Polk was at once a novelty and a reassuring presence. But she also knew how to control her image, staging media events that highlighted her public charity, thrift, and decency. That she was universally esteemed was very much a product of her own doing. Nor was it just political matters she was involved in during James's year in office. She surreptitiously bought and sold slaves for their flourishing Mississippi cotton plantation, providing James with plausible deniability about transactions that he fiercely denied. He said he was having nothing to do with buying and selling slaves, and would have appalled the majority of Americans at the time. Now, Sarah's announcement that she would not be redecorating the White House, as previous First Ladies did, revealed her genius at public relations, I think. Now, the public embraced her for her thrift and good sense, but in fact, leaving the White House in its totally dilapidated current space spared her the work of redecorating, which we know she was totally uninterested in. At the same time, Sarah spent outrageous sums of money on her own clothing, which the public viewed as simple, chaste, and elegant. In the summer of 1847, she spent $450, which was almost $13,000 in today's money, on one order of dresses from Paris. In the place of gems, which were considered too ostentatious and aristocratic for a first lady to wear, she wore cameos and jewelry made out of coral and paste. James paid a New York jeweler $12 for a cameo portrait of himself in the spring of 1847. He presented this to Sarah, and she wore it proudly. So every single day, she wore a cameo portrait of her husband on her dress. Sarah spent a ton of money on clothes. Nobody recognized it because her clothes were so good they looked like they weren't expensive. She spent no money on the White House, which everybody thought proved how thrifty she was. And she helped James K. Polk take part in this war that brought pretty much all of the Southwest into American hands. Now the question is, why has Sarah Childress Polk's contribution to the presidency been overlooked? I think there's three main reasons. The first is that she made sure that nobody recognized what her contribution was to the presidency. She was careful always to downplay her political skills. Quote, she was better informed than it was her disposition to make known. She early learned to be silent when anything was at stake. She never told more than she knew, and she seldom made an effort to display what she said as wisdom. She conferred upon matters of national importance with her husband's associates, but she was always careful to say, Mr. Polk believes so-and-so when expressing her opinions on them. She was, quote, familiar with the great matters exercising the minds of public men, and she read books by every visiting author that came to the White House. She was sure to read it before they came, so she could converse with them about their work. But she also had what a contemporary called intuitive tact. She was, quote, too delicate and reserved to proclaim political opinions or to join in any discussion of party difference. Being so intelligent and well-informed, yet so unobtrusive, she was a charming companion. In other words, she was very good at what she did. Now, the second reason why Sarah Childress Polk's contribution and role as a First Lady has been overlooked is very interesting, and that is that she came to power at the same time as the first women's rights movement. Here we see the Roll of Honor from the Seneca Falls meeting in 1848, where women for the first time asked for rights, said all men and women are created equal, and some women even asked for the right to vote. Yet, in comparison to radicals like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she appeared, Sarah Childress Polk, to be a model of conservatism, and this was an image that she cultivated. She was the anti-radical, a woman who hid her power. Here is who hid her power behind her subservience to her husband. Newspapers described her as, quote, in the highest sense a lady, a model for every woman to imitate, and my favorite, in the approving words of one Southern paper, a sweet exemplification of lowliness. That was a positive review of her. Here we see one wonderful review of the Seneca Falls meeting from the Mechanics Advocate in Albany, New York, making fun of women out of their latitude. So during the time that Sarah Childress Polk is president, women are thinking about wearing bloomers for the first time, and here you see a cartoon of what will happen if women wear pants, which is that bulldogs will hang out with them and they will smoke. Basically it's all over when that happens. And so basically there's a lot going on with gender in this time period, and Sara Polk is presenting herself as the opposite of these radicals. So she's nothing like these women. She's behind her husband 100%. Now, the third reason why I think Sarah Childress Polk's contribution has been overlooked has to do with a deeper issue, and that is the gendering of the presidency and war in general. I'm going to move to this image now, which is from a cheap, basic dime novel account of the U.S. Mexican War, incidents and sufferings of the Mexican War, featuring on the front an image of a woman who was providing water to the men of both sides on the front. The presidency and the war are both gendered masculine. I think we all understand this on some level. Why does there continue to be hostility to the idea of women in combat positions in the army? Because war is the territory of men. How come the United States has yet to elect a woman president, despite the fact that Germany, England, India, even Pakistan have had female chief executives? Because some segment of the population continues to believe that the commander-in-chief should be a man. Now, if that's true now, what must it have been like in the 1840s? But the gendering of foreign policy goes deeper than just the idea that men are the only real soldiers. I want you guys to look at two cartoons about the annexation of Texas from 1844. One in favor of the annexation of Texas. This is making fun of Henry Clay's opposition to the annexation of Texas and showing James K. Polk as this gallant gentleman who's about to invite the incredibly beautiful Texas to join the Union and says, "Welcome, sister. We can't wait to have you join the Union." And she said, "Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm very beautiful." And Henry Clay is looking very kind of priggish, just like, no, not having anything to do with this woman. That's a pro-Texas annexation cartoon. Now let's look at an anti-Texas annexation cartoon. Maddie meeting the Texas question, and here we see Martin Van Buren terrified at Texas, who is this kind of scary-looking, dark-skinned female hag. And here we have various, I think it's Thomas Hart Benton, I think the other one is Polk saying, "Come on, Maddie, come meet this lovely lady." And he's like, "Oh no, anything but that." So let's put them side by side. What do these two cartoons have in common? Gee, I wonder. They're both representing Texas as a woman, right? So we've got a situation wherein Texas is seen as a woman, the United States is annexing it. There's really no room for women to actually be the party that's doing the annexing in this sort of schema. So Sara Polk managed the trick of excelling in the male sphere of politics without seeming to threaten anybody. This was because, as one approving commentator put it, she lived behind her husband as a politician. In an era of increasing agitation for women's rights, Mrs. Polk cultivated a persona of subservience that powerful men found really intoxicating. She was a woman who venerated the work of men. She excelled in it in large part because she publicly embraced what was coming to seem among some women an almost reactionary standard of female subservience. By brilliantly manipulating the gender codes of the day, Sarah Childress Polk became one of the most powerful first ladies in history. Now, the presidency was harder on James than on Sarah. She thrived in office, but by the end of his third year in office, Polk's health was visibly failing. The chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs called on her, Sarah, to warn her that James was, quote, wearing himself out with constant and excessive application. If he did not start taking some recreation, he would die soon after the close of his term. And this chairman of the House Committee suggested that she, quote, insist on driving out morning and evening with him in a carriage. She must order the carriage and make him go with her. Now, Sarah, who understood her husband's destructive work ethics better than anyone, attempted to follow this advice. Day after day, she ordered their carriage, quote, these are her words, and the carriage waited and waited until it was too late. It would have been obliged to wait all day because someone was always in the office, and Mr. Polk would not or could not come. It was hopeless, quote, I seldom succeeded to get him to drive with me. Now, 3 months after leaving office, Polk was dead. Few doubted that he had worked himself to death. And yet, during his single brilliant term, he accomplished a feat that earlier presidents would have considered impossible. With the help of his wife, Sarah, he masterminded, provoked, and successfully prosecuted a war that turned the U.S. into a world power. To James and Sarah Polk, this was not an unjust conflict or an unethical clash. It was a patriotic mission. Sarah dismissed the protest just as her husband had done before. As she told a Nashville reporter, quote, of course there were some opposed. There's always someone opposed to everything. But until the end of her life, she maintained that the acquisition of Texas, California, and New Mexico were, quote, among the most important events in the history of this country, and that whatever sustains the honor and advances the interest of this country, whether regarded as democratic or not, I admire and applaud it. And she should have added she would also help make a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greenberg. What a fascinating discussion. I've always said James K. Polk was one of the most interesting presidents in our history that not a lot of people know about. Now know Sarah Polk is a very interesting figure in our history as well. So thank you again. Questions from the audience, please.
Yeah.
Let me bring the mic to you so that we can get your... Professor Greenberg, your thesis hangs a lot on Sarah being childless. So I have a couple of quick questions. Did she understand that Polk could not father children before they married?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that. They never discussed this. There was never any discussion. Their friends of James wrote him and said things like, wow, Sarah's really active. It's too bad she doesn't have something more domestic to be active with. But I have never found anything between the two of them about that.
Okay. The second question is that this operation that Polk had as a teenager, did it do more damage than infertility? Did it leave him impotent?
Okay, so there's been a lot of debate about that. There was a doctor who wrote a book about the surgery. Well, actually, he wrote an article about it, and another doctor continued and wrote a book about it. The surgery that Polk had for these bladder stones was the first surgery of this sort that had been performed, certainly west of the Appalachian Mountains, and some people argue in the United States. So it was extremely experimental. Polk was basically dying. He was sort of unable to move. He was in excruciating pain. And his father took him a really long way to get the surgery done. And he was great after that, so removing these stones. The doctor who did an analysis of this medically came to the conclusion that it left him, I think, impotent, but I just don't know how you could really know.
So is it possible they're both virgins their entire lives?
See, this is really, I would love to have answers to any of this. I mean, what we do know is that...
I'm trying to find out is why does Polk always look so crabby? You know?
He is crabby, isn't he? He's very crabby. You know, one person pointed out that Polk always wore suits that were 2 sizes too big for him. And another pointed out that he never had a smile on his face. And yeah, he was a crabby guy. I don't know why.
The third question, which is linked to it, did Polk openly discuss with friends, colleagues, well, yes, I'm childless, but it's because of this operation that I had when I was a teenager?
Never.
No. Okay.
Yeah, my question was somewhat along those lines, but it was, I guess I'm left with a comment now. So the comment was, your thesis is that she was able to redirect her energies away from childbearing. So she must have known. Otherwise, I mean, you look at people today and back then, they wait for years for this miracle to happen, you know, and they're pursuing it. So there must have been something that she realized, hey, this isn't going to happen, so I've got another thing to do.
I've had the same thought. I mean, you know, these are such good questions. When I was writing the book, I had to kind of tackle this subject. And actually, I had a discussion with a number of people about this, like, well, do you say what this guy said, that Polk's impotent? No, I mean, that carries so many negative connotations today that I'm not sure they even would have at the time. In the 19th century, there were a lot of people who were celibate by choice. People didn't have the same idea back then that your sexuality is kind of the core of who you are as a person, and ultimately we can't know. So, and I don't even know that we can really know that was why he couldn't have children, but all the rest of his siblings had tons of kids, and all of her siblings had tons of kids, and it was fairly unusual, the situation. And yeah, and I don't know. I mean, we can all imagine, right, a conversation that they had before they were married, but we'll never know. Never know that. More questions? Yeah.
So what did she do after his death?
Oh my God. She lived for 42 years after he died. 42 years, and she wore black the whole time. I'm not kidding. And she lived in the Polk Mansion in Nashville, Tennessee, and she rarely left the house, wearing black the whole time, and she preserved the house as a shrine to her husband. This is actually a big part of the book that I'm writing. What did she end up doing? She did a number of things that were really interesting. During the Civil War, she was a huge advocate for Confederate soldiers who were captured by the Union Army. She used her political ties to the Lincoln administration to get Confederate soldiers released from prison. She ran an auxiliary board that sewed uniforms for Confederate soldiers, and she had some correspondence with Confederates which really did not seem appropriate at the time. But what's interesting is that she maintained that she was above this division between North and South because she was the First Lady. So she made Polk Place neutral. She declared it neutral, And she said it was neutral ground where Union and Confederate soldiers could come meet, but that it would never be occupied by either side. And both sides actually paid attention to this. And in fact, the Union Army protected her mother's property in Tennessee, too. Her mother also lived for 42 years after the death of her father. So she was kind of a strange widow. And one of my favorite pieces of correspondence that a grad student actually found for me, a grad student who's working on Buchanan, he uncovered correspondence when James Buchanan was president in the late 1850s, where Buchanan wrote to Sarah Polk, this is of course after James is dead, and said, I really need these particular documents relating to the annexation of the Oregon Territory. I know that you can get them for me. By the way, would you please consider coming and spending a month or two at the White House? It would not look inappropriate, and you have so many friends here who would like to see you. And she wrote back and she said, here are the papers that you want, which first of all just indicates that he knows she has access to the political material, and she does. She actually can provide it. And then she says, no, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to leave. I'm not going. I'm just going to stay here. And if you know anything about James Buchanan, I mean, he was kind of a cold fish, but the letter is really, it's very warm towards her. It's really like, please come, just leave. You've been in mourning for long enough now. James dies in 1849, like, come on, it's time to get out and come to Washington and do what Dolly Madison does, which is set up a salon and become a political presence and be courted by people, be invited to dinner parties, but she refuses to do it. She just stays in her house. Other questions? Yeah.
I wanted to give you a chance in view of what you said tonight about the lead up to the war, to declare that you're happy on the whole that Texas is part of the Union.
Yes, of course. You guys are allowed to carry guns in public places here, right? We do up in Pennsylvania. We do a little thought experiment of like, well, what if we hadn't annexed Texas? What might have happened? So yeah, sure. I grew up in California, so I can't really complain about this whole Polk endeavor. You're welcome. Yeah.
What happened to the slaves? What did she do? Were any released after he died?
Oh my golly. So in his will, he writes that, first of all, he makes Sarah the executor of his will. So he says, everything's yours. And he says she understands the management of the plantation better than anybody, so she's in charge of it. And she says, it's my wish that my wife will free the slaves when she's ready to do so, like free my slaves, which a number of people have written. He just put in there because news of what the will would become public, and this is this kind of boilerplate language that everybody who owns slaves is expected to say since George Washington freed his slaves upon his death. So there's some expectation that this is going to happen. But she not only doesn't free the slaves, she employs an overseer who doesn't treat them that well, and then right before the Civil War, she's got incredible timing. She sells a 50% ownership in all the slaves to somebody else. So she cashes out $12,500 off of a 50% ownership of all the slaves right before the Civil War, and then takes that cash.
Do you think the Mexico War was really a patriotic mission, or do you think it was their effort at some balance of free states versus non-free states?
Honest to God, I think they really thought of it as a patriotic mission. I do. And, I talked about how I think them being slaveholders influenced how they understood the relations between Mexico and the U.S., and I seriously believe that. But when you look at Polk's diary, he is absolutely flabbergasted that people in the North think that this is about the South gaining power. And he says repeatedly, this is not about slavery. It's not about slavery. This is about manifest destiny. It's about making the continent American. And I think he really did believe that. Now, you could say, well, of course he's deluded because his worldview is entirely tied up with slavery. And in fact, when northern members of his own party introduced the Wilmot Proviso, which suggests that any land that we take from Mexico be free of slaves, he goes bananas. He's like, well, no, of course we can't stand for that. But no, I think he really sees this is his mission. He believes in this, and I think she does too. Yeah.
So if it's manifest destiny, do you think it's possible that he ordered the governor of Tennessee to send troops? Because the majority of the troops in Texas came from Tennessee.
Yeah, they did. Oh, yeah. Well, Kentucky too. A lot of Kentucky.
Tennessee, but so is it possible that he actually told the governor of Tennessee, hey, send men down there because this is what I'm going to do?
You mean at the start of the war?
Yes.
No, see, nobody had to tell anybody to do that because at the start of the war, there were thousands of extra men who wanted to volunteer and go fight wanted to go fight in Mexico, in part because all of these guys had been raised on stories of atrocities committed by Mexicans during the Texas Revolution. So these guys all knew about the Alamo, they all knew about Goliad, and when you look at people's reaction when Polk declares war on Mexico, every single person says, we're going to go kill Mexicans. Like, they want to do it. They really feel like this is their chance to get back at Mexico for what Mexicans did to their brethren, their Texas brethren, many of whom, if not most, actually had come from out of state for the Texas Revolution in the first place. In my book, I talk a lot about volunteers from the Midwest because I think, especially because of the Civil War, we tend to think about the Mexican War, and like what I said about James McPherson, discussing it as like the prelude to the war, we think about it like, well, this is something Southerners were interested in. But when you look at the Midwest actually sends the majority of volunteers. The number one state that sends the most volunteers to the U.S. Mexico War is Missouri, and number two is Illinois. Missouri has slaves, Illinois doesn't. Illinois really kind of does have slaves, but they're not legal. This area is just as fervent about the war as the South is. So, I think it's interesting to look at, like, well, why do they want to go down to Mexico, and why, importantly, and I haven't talked about this at all, do soldiers, once they get to Mexico, decide the whole thing was a disaster? Like, why does it not live up to what they think is going to happen? Yeah?
How would Ms. Polk relate to today's politics looking forward from her life?
I don't know about anything that happened after 1900. Yeah.
Well, from that statement and looking backwards, Dolly Madison is very famous. There's even a recent book on the war of 1812.
Yeah.
Which is Mr. and Mrs. Madison War.
Yep.
Abigail Adams is incredibly famous. Letters between John and Abigail. What happened to Mrs. Polk? You describe her as infinitely more powerful
Yeah.
and influential than either Dolly or Abigail. She seems to have disappeared.
Okay.
I repeat this question.
Yeah, so the question is, everybody knows about Abigail Adams, right? In part because of that John Adams series, I think that was on TV. Everybody knows about Dolly Madison, right? We know that she was this fantastic entertainer, and she was this great force in the White House, and all of the things that she did. And why don't we know about Sarah Polk, who arguably did a whole lot more than either of these women did? And I'm going to return to that They Might Be Giants song, James K. Polk. And in that song, he basically says, nobody in one, they say, no president in one term has accomplished as much as James K. Polk. He had 3 big things that he wanted to accomplish. He accomplished all of them. He brought all of the Southwest into the United States, and yet precious few remember or miss James K. Polk. And I think that has a lot to do with why Sara Polk has been forgotten too. I mean, people do write books about Polk, very interesting books. He's seen as sort of a model for a very aggressive and effective foreign policy. But I don't think there's a lot of room for a woman in this narrative. So again, we're coming back also to the narrative of war being very gendered, and what Polk accomplishes is very, very masculine. But I think in part it's just Americans are not comfortable with the Polks. They're not comfortable with the war between the U.S. and Mexico. And in general, I think it's just a period people would rather forget about. And I can't tell you how many times I have talked about the war with Mexico and people have confused it with the Texas Revolution. So people do not, they're like, oh, well, when does the Alamo happen? And you're like, man, it happened like 8 years ago. It's totally different conflict. I mean, not totally different, but yeah, so it's like people don't, a lot of people feel very happy remembering the Texas Revolution. But I ask you to find anyone who feels happy talking about the Mexican War. Remembering it. Oh, that was great. Remember when we went down to Mexico and we had 15,000 American soldiers died for a conflict that was probably totally unnecessary? Maybe 75,000 Mexican civilians were killed so that we could take California from them? People won't say that. I grew up in Southern California. In my textbook, we skipped directly from the Mission era to the Bear Flag Revolt, and there was never any discussion of how do you go from the missions to the Bear Flag Revolt? Not a word about it. I think I saw one more hand. Over here? Yeah.
You answered, I think. My question was going to be why, going back to when you stated that so many young men from the Midwest stabbed the war with Mexico and then were disappointed in the whole, or so much of America as a whole was disappointed. Why were they disappointed? Was it just what you said about the 15,000 lives lost, 75,000 innocent Mexican civilians, or what else was going on that made it so unpopular and everybody washing their hands like Vietnam or something?
Again, and the Vietnam comparison is really apt. I highly recommend that people buy my book and learn more about this, but I will just say, I'll say quickly, these young men's vision that they're going to go down and they're going to see a Mexican soldier and shoot him, that doesn't happen. That's not how war is. They end up in camp where people get sick and they die of dysentery, and they're buried in shallow graves far away from their families, and their bodies are not returned to the U.S. They see atrocities that are committed against Mexican civilians because everybody's so pissed off they don't have a real battle to fight. And a really important thing is that they don't like Mexico. So they have a vision of Mexico as being a beautiful place where they're going to be able to farm and it'll be great. And they show up, especially in the campaigns in northern Mexico, and they just can't, they think it's awful. They think it's awful. I have a soldier I talk about a lot in the book named John Harden, and he repeatedly writes, he says, there's not 1 acre in 100 here that a man from Illinois would pay taxes on. And they don't like Mexicans. They don't like Mexicans. So these are all the answers, but thank you very much.
Let me just say, rest assured the gentleman who had to leave is being treated by the paramedics and is actually going to be just fine. And also, there is, perhaps you've heard, a book signing. So right out at the registration table, and we look forward to seeing you all either this Saturday or in February. Thank you for coming.